This is our super exciting joint plenary this morning, Imagining Our Collective Futures Through Narrative. For those who are just joining, my name is Ana Serrano, and I'm one of the co-directors of Democracy Exchange alongside Kareem Bardisi and Chris Copperthwaite. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome you to this session. I'm super excited as we chart a course on what could lie ahead by tapping into the incredible imaginations of these three remarkable sci-fi writers or speculative fiction writers. I won't go through the housekeeping because I'm pretty sure most of you heard my rambling of how to work on the speed loop earlier. So we're just going to launch right in. And so what's going to happen is we're going to have such a great 30 minutes because each of these authors will be reading from their works. We'll start with Cory Doctorow first, reading from his latest fiction novel, Attack Surface, which is getting rave reviews everywhere. And in fact, on the chat box, I'm going to ask one of the facilitators to share a link to a Guardian interview that Cory had recently, which not only talks about the book, but also explains a lot of the details of how he sees the world. And I think we need to pay attention to that because it's actually quite pertinent to our present. Following Cory, we'll have Karen Lord, who is a Renaissance woman, has done not just novels, but has done a tremendous amount of work in terms of everything related to research consulting in the Caribbean, as well as social service consulting and things like that, and has just recently put together this remarkable anthology of Caribbean speculative fiction, and we'll be reading from an essay she wrote for this anthology that will also be part of the chat box. So I have put a link in there. It's the Boca Lit Fest who very kindly made this available for everyone to download for free. And so I urge you all to download it because this is not the same as Afrofuturism, which Karen will tell you, but is actually quite particular and specific and has all sorts of really interesting things to share with us about the type of fiction that she's been part of as a community. And last but not least, we've got Waubgeshig Rice, who has written one of the most chilling books I've read in a very long time. You know, I don't know, is this bad to say? I see Stephen King, you know, really thinking that this guy is someone to watch out for. His recent novel is called Moon of the Crusted Snow, and it really kind of speaks to the anticipatory feeling you get when you don't know what's going to happen down the road. And I think it's safe to say that for all of us living through this pandemic times, you know, the specter of what else could possibly happen in 2020 looms large above our heads. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Cory and we will begin.
Thank you very much. Hi. So I'm going to read to you a little from Attack Surface. That's this book that came out yesterday. It's the third Little Brother book. So Little Brother was a pair of young adult novels that came out in the first 2 decades of this century. This one's a standalone novel for adults. And while the first 2 were about someone who is resisting surveillance, the third one is about someone who builds surveillance and control technologies and who's having a moral reckoning with her work. A young woman named Masha, who spends her career building surveillance equipment first for the DHS in America to spy on American dissident movements, and then as a Beltway bandit, a military contractor working in a forward operations base in Iraq, where she spies on jihadis and tries to disrupt insurgent networks, and finally just as a pure for-profit mercenary working on surveillance gear for former Soviet dictators in Eastern Europe, putting down color revolutions. And the whole time, her moral sense of herself as a good person is in free fall. And she has to get into more and more extreme measures to justify what she's doing. Finally, she ends up doing something very self-destructive and has to flee back to America, where she discovers to her horror that her childhood best friend a young woman named Tanisha, who's a Black Lives Matter activist, is being spied on with the same cyber weapons that she's built, and she has to really confront her moral legacy. And in this scene, Masha, the protagonist, Tanisha, her friend, and Marcus and Ange, the heroes of the first two little brother books, are getting arrested. They hit us on the way back across on BART. The train had pulled out of Embarcadero Station and into the tunnel, the new one, all shiny and well lit, as befitted a defiant gesture against the terrorist who'd blown up the original, when it came to a stop, and the conductor came on the intercom and crackled out an announcement about a brief delay. The belts of the Oakland PD officers who entered our car were hung with less lethals and networking gear, and each wore what looked a little like marksman's glasses with black rectangles of electronics on each temple. They were recording everything. They moved down the car, slowly panning their glasses across each person's face. I could hear something in their gear buzzing every time they got a lock and a successful recognition, and then they'd move on. People reacted with careful, controlled neutrality. All conversation ceased. We looked at one another, Tanisha and Marcus and Ange and I. They were getting closer. We were underground, underwater, in a train, in a tunnel. There was nowhere to go. If they were looking for us, they were going to get us. They locked on Marcus. A brief pause. Those shooter's glasses had a little display in them too, I saw. These guys were glass holes, wearing dysfunctional tactical versions of the even more dysfunctional and long-abandoned Google Glass glasses. Try saying that 3 times fast. Then they alighted on Tanisha. The cop stiffened like he'd been shocked. We all saw it. He was white, young, brown-haired, a little chubby, a baby face. His partner was older, South Asian, white sidewall haircut and skinny. The two of them closed in on us. "Ma'am," white cop said to Tanisha, "can we see some ID?" Tanisha looked around the car. Everyone was watching us and trying not to let it show. A couple people, both black guys, both young, had their phones out and were recording. That was gutsy and maybe stupid. I could see Marcus wanted to get his phone out. He kept it in his pants. "Am I under arrest?" Like a bus card come to life. Marcus was pale now. I knew his story. My guess was that he was living a specific bad moment out of his past. I had an idea of which one. "Not yet." Whitey was a comedian. His partner didn't like that. "Am I being detained?" That was the next bus card question. The one after that was, "Am I free to go?" Which would be hilarious given where we were. "We'd like to check your ID, ma'am. You are legally required to identify yourself." The older guy was trying to keep everything cool. He could feel those cell phone cameras drilling into his back. "I think you're supposed to show him ID," Ange said. The older cop gave her a tight smile. Tanisha slowly reached inside her jacket. They both tensed up, and so we tensed up, and so everyone who was around us tensed up too, and drew out her wallet with 2 fingers, opened it, and brought her to California non-driver ID. We used to tease her about being the only one of us who never wanted to learn to drive. The younger cop took it in, examined both sides, and then tapped it to a reader on his belt. Seconds crawled. We heard the buzz of both cops' systems. "We would like you to come with us, please." The older guy said it calmly and in a voice tone pitched to Carrie, talking for the camera phones as much as for Tanisha. "Am I under arrest?" She was so calm, calmer than I'd be. I wondered if it was the first time she'd been arrested. I hadn't thought to ask. "You are being detained." "I invoke my right to counsel. I invoke my right to silence. I do not consent to a search of my person or my belongings." She said them like a mantra, loudly, crisply, like a manifesto. One of the black guys recording her whooped. Someone clapped a little. It was a hell of a performance, an underwater civics lesson delivered in a crowded tin can. The cops nodded like they'd heard it before. I'm sure they had. We all looked at each other like, are we gonna let them lead her off? "I'd like to accompany her," Marcus said. "Can I see your ID?" Marcus swallowed. This was clearly going to go around and around in circles. Marcus could grandstand for days. I held out my hand at him, and I took out my own ID, not nearly as slowly as Tanisha had, but still avoided getting gunned down where I sat. The young guy took it, nearly fumbled it, scanned it. Whatever data came up, it was more than would fit on his stupid little heads-up display, because he took out his phone and scrolled for a while, conferring with his partner. Everyone stared at me. Everyone. I was someone the cops had to whisper about before deciding on their next move. "You're staying," the young one said. People stared harder. I was a snitch, an undercover, a diplomat, a VIP, the president's niece. "I'm going," I said. My mouth was dry. "I'm going, and I'll either follow you until you cuff me, or I'll come along quietly and not get in the way." The younger one rolled his eyes. "You're under arrest for obstruction." He began to recite my rights. Numbly, I held out my hands for the cuffs. The old man made a twirling motion, and I turned around and put my wrists together behind my back. The cuffs were plastic, tight, but not painful. Maybe one of my little group said something. I couldn't hear anything over the roaring of the blood in my ears. What the actual fuck was I doing? The old one led me. The young one took Niche. She wasn't in cuffs. We walked through the car, and the cop said something to the conductor, who quietly asked the passengers, one-on-one, to clear out. They retreated to the other end of the car. The train jolted to a start. Its motion made me to remember to say, "I am invoking my right to silence. I am invoking my right to an attorney. I do not consent to a search." Tanisha gave me an unreadable look, and the young cop rolled his eyes so hard they fell out and onto the dirty carpet of the BART car. Our friends stood at the front of the crowd on the other end of the car. "We're getting you a lawyer," Ange called after us. Marcus was tapping furiously on his phone. "We have their badge numbers." Ange's voice carried remarkably well over the sound of the wheels starting to move again. And that's the reading.
Wow. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Cory. We'll hear more. I'm so excited to read this book. So Karen Lord, you're up next.
Thank you so much, Anna. Well, as Anna would have said to you, this is from an essay called The Sanctuary Sea, and it is basically the introduction to a mini anthology that we did for the Bocas Lit Fest. Their first day on September the 18th was called Future Friday, and we were encouraged to look at post-pandemic Caribbean futures. We put together this thing, we call it Reclaim, Restore, Return, Futurist Tales from the Caribbean. And I'm just going to read, which is basically a summary of what you would find in it. We started with reprints of stories that fortuitously and accurately spoke to our peculiar situation in 2020. Two stories from two Trinidadian writers were taken from the 2016 PCASH Press anthology, New Worlds, Old Ways, Speculative Tales from the Caribbean. Though already more than 4 years old, Brandon O'Brien's Fallen Angel.dll, a story of corruption and neglected communities, remains disturbingly contemporary as we consider, both regionally and globally, what weapons we should allow our police to wield for and against the people they are intended to serve. In Cascadura, Hadassah K. Williams gives us a glimpse of the diaspora's nightmare, a catastrophe so complete that home is destroyed before you can return to it. Although during the pandemic, our countries remained intact, the closing of borders and grounding of airlines made too many of us as landless and forsaken, though temporarily so, as Williams's protagonist. Cadwell Turnbull, who hails from the US Virgin Islands, gave us a story of monstrous hurricanes and those who remain in their path. More poignantly for this era, this present era, when test and trace and care for the elderly and vulnerable have become of paramount importance, his story, Monsters Come Howling in Their Season, introduces an artificial intelligence, aptly called Common, who is not the terror of state surveillance, but a community's eye that guides the work of their hearts and hands. If Cascadura is the nightmare, Nalo Hopkinson's warm-hearted repatriation is the diaspora's dream. Climate refugees return at last to a Jamaica that is healing its tourism-ravaged coral reefs with the ancient hulks of decommissioned cruise ships. Hopkinson's image of a rusting fleet on its final journey now seems like a harbinger of itineraries undone by COVID and closed harbors, and empty vessels sheltering in place at permitted locations, uncertain of their future and the future of their entire industry. For the Mighty Slinger, I collaborated with Tobias S. Buckel to write a long view future with Caribbean roots and a multiplanetary scope. Saving an environmentally degraded Earth from demolition and gentrification by the super rich takes time, influence, and money. We gave our revolutionary CAISO band plenty of each, with periodic suspended animation, the support of generations of a Caribbean dynasty dedicated to politics and service, and the riches of best-selling calypso tunes with conscious lyrics. That story, published 4 years ago, contained the seeds of a Caribbean futurism, where policy, science and technology, and the arts work together in a long game towards a better future for the region and the world. It also highlighted the perennial issue of the exploitation of migrant workers and the changes needed to empower those workers. Beyond the premonitions of crises now unfolding and the déjà vu of continuing injustices, this collection of reprints contains a set of overarching themes that may provide the template for our nascent future. These themes are not a to-do list. We do not have to tick one item off before we can proceed to the next. They are a cycle of interacting and repeating actions that comprise an engine of progress. They are, in no particular order, reclaim, restore, return. A focus on reclaiming sets the revolutionary tone of the anthology. Take control of the technology and processes that govern and regulate your daily life. Hold fast to your oceans and lands and all the wealth they contain for your generation and the generations to come. Demand your right to the dignity of work for a living wage. Embrace and protect your community, the strong and the weak, the little and the large. There's no true hospitality without ownership. Offering a welcome into a home that is not yours makes you a servant, not a host. The freedom to safely open and close the door to our own sanctuary is true hospitality. But home cannot be a sanctuary when others are hungry or in danger. There are no moats broad enough and no walls high enough to cut us off from our duty of care to our neighbor and to the sojourner. Restoring is both stewardship and self-care, external and internal. Healing our environment, the lands, the coasts, and the seas that are home, brings comfort and stability, which in turn heals our generational trauma of pain and upheaval. Within the oasis of that new stability, we naturally reorder our priorities, considering the true value of our heritage and the real costs and consequences of our actions and inaction. Imagine a future where the Caribbean Sea is a sanctuary sea with sustainable fishing and protected biodiversity. Visualize the restoration of coral reefs and mangrove swamps using homegrown technology that already exists in the here and now. Can we monitor and secure our coastlines, our exclusive economic zones, and the open sea that connects us and surrounds us for the benefit of all? This is not merely border control, but boundaries control in every sense. Returning is essential, a mental and physical imperative to every child of the Caribbean. 4 of the stories, Cascadura, Monsters Come Howling in Their Season, Repatriation, and The Mighty Slinger, confront the fact that often people don't leave the Caribbean because they want to, but because they have to. They migrate away from stagnant economies, declining infrastructure, or the wreckage of hurricanes, earthquakes, and other disasters. Soon, they will move to escape sea level rise, drought, and killing heat, and environments made toxic by unregulated industry. Migration is an aspect of our people's history that stretches from pre-emancipation to post-independence. But where will we go when the whole world is on fire? These stories urge us to return when we can, before misfortune or resignation closes the way back. Our last two pieces are original work commissioned specially for this project. They are a powerful duo of myth and manifesto, repurposing the fragments of the old, shattered world into a new construction. Shivani Ramlochan's poem, A Letter from the Leader of the Android Rebellion to the Last Plantation Owner of the Federated Caribbean Bloc, vividly illustrates our ultimate emancipation in modern metaphor. Tobias Espekel's Category 6 is a story of taking charge in the midst of chaos, as well as a seductive blueprint for how we might jumpstart our regional project once more, tying our lands and peoples together with transport links and mutual aid, offering home to the diaspora and haven to the homeless. Thank you, that's it. And I just want to add, because Ana mentioned it, that we can consider Caribbean futurism in a sense a subset of Afrofuturism. But of course, the reality is that we have so many blended cultures and origins here, from the indigenous to the Indo-Caribbean to the Sino-Caribbean, as well as the Afro and European influences. So it's not quite fair for us to only call it Afrofuturism, and I do make a point of mentioning that. Thank you so much.
Reclaim, restore, return. I can't imagine a more fitting set of 3 R's that we all need to learn right now. You know, it's no longer about reading arithmetic, and I don't even remember what the last R is, but it's about reclaim, restore, return, and perhaps repair, but that's probably the same as restore. So Wob, off to you.
Okay, Chimigwech, thank you very much, Ana. And thank you very much, Karen and Cory, for sharing. It's an honor to be here with you all today. Chimigwech, thank you very much to the organizers of the Democracy Exchange for inviting me to share with you all. And as Ana mentioned, I'll be reading a bit from my latest novel, Moon of the Crested Snow. It's a story about a Northern Ontario First Nation that endures wide communications and power outage. They eventually discover it's widespread and, in fact, a world-ending event. So the story follows this community as it sort of returns to the land and finds a way to pick up the pieces and also reclaim, restore, and return in many ways. And the passage I'm going to read you is a big thing, excuse me, an important theme of the story is sort of taking a look at the past and understanding the perspective already having endured an end of the world moment, and how using that knowledge and wisdom can rebuild a future, a better future, based on some of the original principles and philosophies that survived on this land since time immemorial, essentially. And I'm talking about the land that our culture calls Turtle Island, more widely known as North America. So the passage I'm going to read you is the start of the second part of the book. It's broken up into 2 parts. The first part is the immediate aftermath of the blackout, and the second part is a few months later in the winter, when sort of chaos essentially has set in and the community is trying to find ways to heal and move forward, all the while contending with some unexpected visitors from the city to the south. So the protagonist is Evan Whitesky, and in this particular passage, he's sort of doing his rounds through the community, checking on the elders, and he's visiting the central elder figure in the story. Her name is Aileen, and they sort of have a bit of a visit here and talk about their situation, talk about their past and what that means for their future. Evan rummaged through the old man's closet, feeling for heavy winter jackets, or at least thick wool. The dark, damp basement already reeked of mold, and as he reached deeper into the garments, the scent of mothballs danced with the must in his nostrils. He felt a coarse jacket and pulled it out into the faint daylight coming through the small window above his head. It was a formal military blazer. He recognized it from Remembrance Day ceremonies and grand entries at powwows. He remembered the old man looking proud and mighty every time he put it on. But here in this lonely, near-empty basement, it looked stiff and rotting. Evan held it higher for a better look. The blue wool had faded and felt thin. He noticed that the buttons on the sleeves and the breast weren't actually gold as he had always thought as a child. They were brass and tarnished. He ran his calloused fingertip across the 3 smaller ones on the jacket's left wrist, feeling the bumps and grooves of the tiny crests. He pictured the old man holding the eagle staff proudly, wearing this military garb. The button's golden charm had seemed to accentuate the flags and feathers on the ceremonial stave. But they no longer shone. They never did, really. Evan wondered if Remembrance Day would ever happen again. The wood furnace in the middle of the room blasted heat that dissipated as it reached the unfinished concrete walls. He replaced the jacket and closed the closet door, then fed another 5 pieces of wood into the furnace. Isaiah would come later in the evening to feed the fire again for the old lady. Aileen was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping from the tea she had promised Evan. She still had an old wood cook stove in her kitchen, and she could handle keeping it stoked, but she was too frail now to load the furnace in the basement. The main floor was toasty, and it comforted Evan to know that Aileen was okay. He took off his jacket and placed it on the back of the wooden chair across from the elder. She put down her cup, and she smiled at him through her big glasses. "Everything okay down there?" she asked. Evan looked down at the full cup in front of him, then to hers. She had wrapped her thin, wrinkled fingers around the hot glass for warmth. The sleeves of her pink sweater were fraying at the end. "Yeah, everything looks good. You got lots of wood still," he replied. "Izzy will be by tonight to top it up." "I really appreciate you boys doing this for me, Wedge." "It's nothing, Auntie. We're happy to help." Aileen was the last of the generation race speaking Anishinaabemowin with little English at all. She was one of only a few dozen left who could speak their language fluently. She remembered the old ways and a lot of the important ceremonies. She had more knowledge than everyone else about the traditional lives of the Anishinaabe. "Anisha Jibamadzian?" he asked. "No, yeah, I'm warm. I have lots to eat. I get a lot more company these days. How are you doing?" He paused. He couldn't remember the last time someone had asked him that. His pace had been frenetic in the strange darkness of this new era. "I'm okay, I guess. How are the kids?" "Oh, they're good. They've been spending a lot of time outside. I don't think they miss school at all." He chuckled and she giggled. "What about your buzzgum?" "Oh, she's tired, but she's getting by. She really appreciates all the things you're teaching her about the old medicine ways, but she still gets stuck at home a lot with the kids while I'm out here doing stuff." "Well, you make sure you spend some time with her. Go for a walk in the bush. When the spring comes, ask her to show you some of the medicines. She'll know a lot now if she remembers all the stuff when I used to take her and all the young girls out there. It'll be important if we don't get any new supplies in from the hospital down south." Evan thought of Nicole at home, trying to prepare herself for the skills they would need if the power was gone for good, while struggling to keep the children occupied. He felt a twinge of guilt. She often looked tired these days. She didn't talk as much as she used to and hardly smiled anymore. No one smiled much this winter. "That's a good idea," he said. "Maybe I'll take the kids over to my parents' place tomorrow or the day after. Your mom will appreciate the cookum time." "Yeah, for sure." He brought the hot tea to his chapped lips and sipped. The liquid seeped into the cracks and burned, but he showed no reaction. He learned to keep his thoughts behind a careful mask. He could not show weakness, especially now. But the old woman could still make him smile. "Did you find anything down there in Eddie's closet?" she asked. "I found one of his old army jackets, but I didn't want to take it." "The one he wore for ceremonies?" "Yeah, that one." "Ah, yes, he loved that one." She looked out the window. Her husband had served in the Korean War and had been the last wartime military veteran in the community. He had died 4 years ago, disappointed that no young people had followed in his path. He had been celebrated as a strong warrior and a respected elder. Evan thought about him now, wondering if he would have been able to help guide the young people through this catastrophe if he were still alive. Evan sipped the tea slowly. There was no need to fill the silence. If we can make it through this winter, Evan thought, we'll be okay. Often Aileen shared a teaching or an old story with the young men when they came to visit. Once in a while, someone would bring a group of children or teens to hear some old Nanabush stories or her memories of the old days. There had been no electricity in this community when she was a child, and parents sometimes brought the young ones to her to remind them that life was possible without the comforts of modern technology. Now it was critical that they learn how the old ones lived on the land. You know, when young people come over, sometimes some of them talk about the end of the world, Aileen said, breaking the silence and snapping Evan out of his wool gathering. He looked up from the plaid pattern on the vinyl tablecloth to the old woman's face. They say that this is the end of the world. The power's out and we've run out of gas. No one's come up from down south. They say the food is running out and we're in danger. There's a word they say too, apocalypse? Yes, apocalypse. What a silly word. I can tell you there's no word like that in Ojibwe. Well, I never heard a word like that from my elders anyway. Evan nodded, giving the elder his full attention. Our world isn't ending, she went on. It already ended. It ended when the Jaganash came into our original home down south on that bay and took it from us. That was our world. When the Jaganash cut down all the trees and fished all the fish and forced us out of there, that's when our world ended. They made us come all the way up here. This is not our homeland. But we had to adapt, and luckily we already knew how to hunt and live on the land. We learned to live here. She became more animated as she went on. Her small hands swayed as she emphasized the words she wanted to highlight. But then they followed us up here and started taking our children away from us. That's when our world ended again. And that wasn't the last time. We've seen what's the word again? Apocalypse. Yes, apocalypse. We've had that over and over, but we always survived. We're still here and we'll still be here, even if the power and the radios don't come back on and we never see any white people ever again. Evan gazed back down to the table. He felt his shoulders ease and his chest open up. He was tired, but she gave him hope. You're right, Auntie, he said. I never thought of it that way. He smiled and she smiled back, crow's feet creasing at the corners of her eyes. Well, I should probably head back out there, he said as he tipped back the cup into his mouth. Okay then, busy day? Not really, just gotta tie up some loose ends. He didn't want to tell her the morbid details of his next task. He got up and put on his jacket and zipped it up. He took the black toque out of his right pocket and pulled it over his shaggy black hair, which nearly hung into his eyes. He said miigwech and smiled before walking out the back door. Miigwech, thank you.
Thank you very much, Wob. This is really quite special. I mean, I don't know if all of you folks out there got chills when Cory, Karen, and Wob all read. And like, you know, my thing is like, I really think artists should just run the world. That's how I think. And so, my first question for the three of you is the following. So Cory was recently interviewed in the Guardian article that was already pasted on the chat. And in this interview, he said, thinking about the near future, that fiction gives you an emotional fly-through. I love that phrase, emotional fly-through. It invites you to consider the lived experience of what is otherwise a very abstract and technical debate. Now, technical doesn't necessarily need to mean technology, but also just the technical debate of like, well, what kind of future do we want to have? Like, what does that look like? Or what could it be if we don't do X, Y, Z? So could you please each speak to the power of fiction in helping us not just understand, but viscerally feel what our futures could be like if we don't do X, Y, Z, or if we deign to imagine what a better future could be. So who wants to start? Cory? Oh, Wob? Go ahead, Wob.
Okay, I'll go first. Well, I think if you consider, I guess, the so-called canon of dystopian or post-apocalyptic fiction in recent decades, I think the primary premise of most of it was to take a really close look at the dysfunctions of our current societies and just sort of amplify how things could go horribly wrong, right? And I think a lot of classic books do that in really effective ways. You know, we think about Brave New World or 1984, Fahrenheit 451, etc. But I think those are mostly about very destructive and negative outcomes, right? And with the perspective we have nowadays about speculating a new future, we can talk about a wide array of perspectives and how we can consider building something better, right? How we can repair some of the damage we've done as a society. And I think that's really exciting, you know, and it really is in many ways community building. It's taking from, well, not taking from, but sort of collaborating amongst the various communities that exist on the land and in our societies right now, and trying to find a way to do things better. And, you know, in some ways, the pandemic has really put that under the microscope, hopefully anyway. Of course, this is sort of a rose-colored glasses way of looking at things very optimistically, but I think that potential is there. And as fiction writers, I don't want to speak for Karen and Cory, but I think we have the ability to sort of highlight those things and then really take some liberties and present them in the ways that we want, and not have to sort of rely on, I guess, the confines of reality and journalism, I guess you could say, right? So I guess just lastly, I would just say being able to speculate and create a future is one of the great benefits of fiction.
Yeah, and in fact, Karen, I think you speak to that. I mean, this anthology was so timely and so really almost like a needed balm for people to understand what are the potentials. Can you expand on your commentary?
Well, yeah, I was going to say, well, first I need to address something in Bob's reading. I love the way you tied the blackout and the idea of the apocalypse, because the same way you have rolling blackouts, we have a concept of what you call a rolling apocalypse, which is to say that, you know, bad things have been happening to your people for so many generations that you just sort of find a way through it. You light a candle somehow. And in many respects, fiction is the way you light a candle. You mentioned that, is it a way for us to make people to feel, to connect, to have that emotional response? But I think it can actually do more than that. This is probably my bias because of my background in socioeconomic research, but literature can be a thought experiment. Where it kind of is a little flawed is when we focus on one thing to the absence of others. So sometimes you get some literature that's all about just one person's internal journey, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I'm fascinated by the literature that brings together all the moving parts, that says, here's the context, here is how one thing influences another thing. And if you can get that kind of literature working, I think that really puts the light bulb in place for people, where they understand that they're not one single entity in a world that they have to shape some way, but the world is going to shape them, and other people are going to shape them, and they're going to have to connect in some way. And there's so many things that we have to look after and that look after us. So there's a kind of a heavy responsibility and an amazing challenge for us to be able to do all that in a way that has the right repercussions.
Yeah, and that's actually a fantastic segue into Cory, because that's what he's been trying to do with this series, for sure.
Yeah, you know, Daniel Denning talks about intuition pumps, the idea that we go through these hypothetical scenarios as a way of mentally rehearsing what we might do in various eventualities. And I think apocalyptic literature's got a lot to answer for here. I think that when you're writing pulp fiction, which science fiction is, and which I'm proud to write, that you tend to look for the ways to make the plot as plotty as possible, that the engine that drives things is lots of verse, chorus stuff happening. And, you know, the historic two plots are person versus nature and person versus person. And if you're a pulp writer, you're always attuned to opportunities to get a twofer with person versus nature versus person, which is when the tsunami knocks your house down, your neighbors come over to eat you. And while that it makes for cheap and easy plotting, it's not very true to our human history. I mean, clearly human behavior is a spectrum, and our history is riddled with sociopaths who murdered their way to glory. But the majority of us, the reason we're still here is because of our solidarity and cooperation. And people who've lived through disasters, and the literature of disasters tells us that when crisis hits, instead of that being the starting gun for an orgy of violence, it's instead the moment at which the refrigerator hum of petty grievance ends, and in that ringing silence that remains behind it, you realize how much you have in common with the people around you, not how different you are. And that's the moment when we tend to pull together. Anyone who's lived through blackouts, anyone who's lived through blizzards and lockdowns knows that this is part of our experience, and that depending on how the elites around us treat us, they can evince reactions that make us act as though the disaster is a game of musical chairs in which the chairs are going to disappear. And if you're not in a chair, you're going to be under the table where things are very unpleasant indeed. Or they can encourage and upregulate that solidarity. And for me, with storytelling, one of the things I'm trying to do is tell very plot forward pulp stories that are about people's goodwill and the conflicts that arise from those. I actually think those are much more plotty stories than the story in which your neighbor just turns out to have inexplicably been a villain all along, a fact that was only revealed once the strictures of society were removed. Instead, I'm interested in the kind of story where people who are of goodwill and notionally on the same side have an irreconcilable difference that is salient and important and that they can't get past, right? It's the difference between losing an argument at Christmas dinner and winning an argument at Christmas dinner. Winning an argument at Christmas dinner is the worst, because then you never speak to those people again. So those disputes, surfacing those disputes, is not only truer to the human condition, but it's also the thing I want us to prime our intuition pumps for. I want us to prime our intuition pumps for good faith, irreconcilable disagreements that we will have to overcome, for the wave of crises, the rolling apocalypse we just heard about, that is right there on our horizon, and that is in fact washing over us even as we speak now. Because that's the real thing that we're going to have to contend with, not the elite panic of people who think that as soon as the lights go out, we're going to come and take away their mansions and eat them. But instead, the real meaningful disagreements we'll have about what people of goodwill should do to pull us all through.
Well, funnily enough, that's exactly what Democracy Exchange is all about, right? Which is, bringing together this cross-partisan group of folks who are trying desperately to keep some form of democratic practice together, and it is about these disagreements. And so, so I'll ask a really naughty question, and my apologies. So the question I have is this is all great for democracy, what you're talking about, Cory, but is there a tension between trying to create these meaningful stories of irreconcilable discussions or difficult discussions, and feeding a hungry audience that's essentially looking for pat answers or black and white stories, and have been fed a type of narrative, a structure that demands less sophisticated sort of plotting, as you suggested. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how you folks sort of deal with that tension.
Shall I go first?
Sure. Go ahead.
I think that the depths of good faith conflict sustain longer stories, right? That in this sort of golden age of television and multi-season stories, that the apocalyptic narratives, the Walking Dead narrative, I don't know about you folks, I started reading a comic and then I watched the TV show, and then I just dropped out because it was the same every week. It was like, look, we've met another group of people who turn out to be just revolting bastards, and what kind of statistical illiteracy does it take to believe that you and everyone are just flawed vessels and ordinary mediocrities who have good days and bad days, but 99.99999% of everyone else, whether or not they're a zombie, is still a homicidal maniac, right? What incredible luck it must be for you to have found those 7 other plucky adventurers who can be redeemed when everyone else was so terrible. And it gets not just crushing, but tedious. And I think that the at its best, the parts where I've dipped back into Walking Dead, for example, are the parts where there are those good faith disagreements, where there are people who are trying to rebuild, and they just have an irreconcilable difference about what to do in those rebuildings. Those stories are really tense because you care about everybody. You've got a dog on both sides of the fight. And I think that they make better pulp stories, not just better political messages, but better pulp stories.
Excellent. Karen.
I just want to add to that. I fully agree. And I'm going to say one thing that's probably a little, not quite revolutionary, but maybe unwanted. Another thing I think people will agree with. And the first one is, I think you can train the reader's palate. I think we learn to like what we're exposed to. So, you're going to just have to change the literature and draw the reader along with you. So that's the first thing, maybe controversial, maybe not. The second thing is, some of the most skilled storytellers I've encountered find a way to blend both the smash and the bang and the nuance. And my two examples of that are the fight between Inigo and the Man in Black in The Princess Bride, both the book and the movie, because it is a fight which reveals so much of their characters and their motivations. And as you say, they're coming from different directions, but they still have respect for each other. So that's one. And the other one is from the movie Hero, where Nameless, Jet Li's character, and Sky, not sure, Donnie Yen's character, they are having a fight. But before they even touch weapons, they stand and they work it out in their minds. And again, that says so much about their character and their motivations, and it just like marries the two together. And those are the fight scenes that I watch over and over again because it's given me both levels. It's given me both levels. I think you can train the reader by giving them both levels so that then even when you're just giving them only the nuance and not the adrenaline, they're there for the nuance as well.
And do you think that if you train them to read literature like that, they'll be better democratic practitioners?
I think nothing is a magic pill, but I'm willing to try everything that I have within my power. I think that since my skill is in storytelling, it's my job to try to make that happen. And there are people for whom it won't make a difference, but hopefully there's something else out there that someone is skilled at that will make the difference for them.
Great. What about you, Wob?
Yeah, really interesting. And I agree with both Cory and Karen. You know, when you're talking about our modern democratic system, especially here in Canada, I think the way these political narratives arise, especially in the media, is of just that black and white, good versus evil, my side or your side, left versus white binary that Cory mentioned earlier, right? And that really takes away from that nuance. So, you know, hopefully if readers come along and we guide them to look more into that gray area of nuance, you know, they will become more engaged and maybe push back against some of those media narratives of just having one side or the other, you know? And it should be about more than, you know, just two choices. Unfortunately, it's not, especially, you know, south of the border from here. But nowadays, I think with the pandemic and a lot of people turning to post-apocalyptic or dystopian fiction, I think they're looking for those stories with a little more detail and, you know, that nuance with that underlying hope. And I think, you know, readers are becoming more sophisticated and not just looking at, you know, those back and forth stories or one side versus the other stories, right? So hopefully, yeah, maybe, you know, authors can sort of turn the tide on that discussion and we'll get a healthier democracy will arise as a result of that.
So let's talk about we have 5 minutes, but I was so struck by the reclaim, restore, return, you know, and I love the fact that there's the 3 R's. And then, you know, there's also this massive repair movement as well, which is kind of the same thing that you're talking about. Can we just speak a little bit about, you know, the role that fiction, especially speculative fiction, is going to play in fixing things? Because, I mean, you kind of speak to it. And so one of the things we talked about is this, you know, a difficult conversation. So needing to understand how to reconcile, you know, paths, different paths. But what other forms of repair or restoration or reclamation or reparations or returnings do we need to pay attention to? Who wants to start? Cory, can you take that? Karen,
Karen's
go.
turn.
Karen, go.
Okay, I think that's a question that in itself demands a nuanced answer, because there are definitely some issues that we share, but there's some things that are very specific, not only to our regions, but to our peculiar histories. What I did try to, what we did find as we put together our readings, our reprints in the anthology, is that the theme of justice is actually a very, very strong guiding factor. If you consider not only, well, not only consider the past in terms of the mistakes you make and how you go forward, but also in terms of dealing with those mistakes and finding solutions for those mistakes. In some respects, you are already solving things for the future. So I think that for a lot of us, being a futurist also means being a historian, means looking and tying the two together and understanding that, and they're never disconnected. And the present is where you have to deal with both of them. Sorry, that's a whole off question, but I just, that's how I would be able to view that.
I can't imagine a more elegant answer, actually, Karen. That was really beautiful. Waub, you're nodding your head. Do you want to have something to add there?
Yeah, I think, you know, it's really about understanding our place in our environment and reconnecting with the land that we're a part of. And what I think the pandemic has highlighted is the disconnect we have, especially those of us in urban places, from the land, and specifically the food that we consume. You know, we are reliant upon these food supply chains and food coming in from elsewhere into our cities. And we may not necessarily understand or have the skill to feed ourselves if that supply chain breaks down, right? So what I try to get across in a lot of my fiction writing is just that importance of that connection with the land and our understanding as human beings that we are a part of it and that we should respect it and that we, you know, should operate as one with it. And that's perhaps the solution, you know, to the collapse is, you know, reestablishing that bond and just really understanding it and respecting it at the same time.
And for you, Cory, can we repair this, like, you know, monopolistic technology, techno-deterministic environment we find ourselves in?
Well, you know, this is a question I'm really digging into in a book that I'm writing now called The Lost Cause, which is a post-Green New Deal utopian disaster novel, a novel where the disasters that we've set in motion continue to run. I mean, I always say that if you think that we're not going to have runaway climate change, you're thinking in fantasy, not in science fiction, because we have sunk a lot of heat into the oceans. And we're not going to repeal the second law of thermodynamics. And that means that we will see massive polar melting and seas rising and massive displacement, especially among low-lying places like the Caribbean. And those are scientific irrefutables that do not invite contrafactuals. And so our contrafactual has to be not about fantasy, but about science fiction, about what a positive result would look like. And my novel starts with a surprise election in Canada in which a road allowance Métis woman who's leading the NDP becomes PM during a crisis that makes the current one look like a rehearsal, and creates something that they call the Canadian miracle that starts with a relocation of Calgary out of the floodplain. This sparks a global movement of Canadian blue helmets that go around the world to teach this LEAP manifesto style grand infrastructure projects that involve everything from relocating every coastal city 20 kilometers inland to dealing with hundreds of millions of displaced people and pandemics and new food security measures and so on, which creates a solidarity grid of blue helmets that travel everywhere. And it's a novel about truth and reconciliation with white nationalist militias who think that they're living in a dystopia, and what we do about the losers of revolutions that we support. This is something we've never really figured out. And it's a rebuttal to something that I was very excited about a few years ago, which is what we sometimes jokingly call fully automated luxury communism, the idea that we would have enough robots that work would end. And we have full employment, right? We have, like, I don't care how many robots you build, relocating all of our cities, dealing with hundreds of millions of displaced people, if not billions, dealing with wildfires, floods, all of the things that are in our future, in our foreseeable future, rising to that occasion involves labor, and labor beyond the imagining, and reallocating our resources to that project is a a heroic narrative. It's a positive and utopian narrative, even though it's posed against a background. And so I like to think that the narrative that we need is one in which we have a generation that for the first time in a century doesn't fear the future, even though they know what's coming.
You know, I think we have the 3 authors right here who are definitely going to write that narrative. And I can't thank you all 3 enough for being here with us, for kicking off this event. I'm even more, you know, we are even more bullish on the fact that we need artists to be part of this this broad project of creating our futures together. And thank you so much for being here with us. And there's now 5 tracks open to the attendees. Feel free to choose your sessions. And Cory, Karen, and Waub are going to be around. Feel free to chat with them. Thank you so much. So if you can hear this, this is what everyone is doing in the feed loop. Take care, everyone.